Can I use Git to version control PSD files and Maya projects? I've had great success with Git, version controlling, sharing and collaborating on my programming projects, and would love to do the same with Photoshop.psds, Illustrator.ace and Maya projects. Maya, as you may know, is a brilliant 3D modeling and rendering kit, but its projects are saved sort of like a programming framework, with various directories for source images and textures and the like. Is it an industry practice to use Git in this regard? It would be incredible to open source a 3D movie or the 3D files of a game on GitHub. Obviously all files are just numbers, so in theory Git would be fine only updating the parts of the .jpegs or Maya binaries that have changed, but do you think in reality this would cause data corruption and tears? Like I say, I'd like to do the same with Photoshop and Illustrator files. If Git is not an option, how else should I version, collaborate, and open source Maya and Adobe projects?
One thing to keep in mind is that Git does not work well with really large repos or files. Here is an article about why Facebook isn't using Git for their version control. Basically, Git didn't scale well enough. GitHub has a good explanation of Git's limitations here. Git can handle almost any file that you throw at it, see an explanation of binary difference. Photoshop. You should have no problem using Git to version a Photoshop file, assuming they are relatively small. Maya. Maya likely generates too big of projects to scale well in Git, especially if you plan on pushing to a remote like GitHub or GitLab. Most of the people I know who use Maya or similar software keep their work on a network-mounted drive to share with just a couple of collaborators. When a version is ready for release, it is rendered and hosted on a FTP site. Additional resources. Semantic versioning. This URL.
I've had this issue for a long time as well. Done quite some research and there are a few options for you to version control your graphical assets. Some of them require your own server, some requires you to specifically run Windows Server, and some can be hosted on a third-party server. My favorite, although not completely satisfactory, was Timeline from Pixel Novel. There's a similar question here about Timeline. In my experience, you should make sure that all your collaborators are using the same version of the software, both Timeline and PS/AI/Maya. Older versions of PS requires you to run an older version of Timeline which doesn't handle the working tree the same way as in more up-to-date versions. I've also version controlled large graphical assets with regular subversion, no GUI, and I found it wasn't all that bad if you're okay with using the terminal. Of course, things like merging, conflicts etc. isn't possible with binaries, but at least you get a neat version management with a structured log. Also, with SVN you can lock a file while working with it, which Timeline does for you. I prefer not to use Git with graphics, though I do for non-binaries, and the points made by Sputter are very valid.
If you want to support the channel, please consider liking and subscribing.